We hear a lot of talk about growing, developing, improving our actions, improving our character, improving our service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. All of that entails personal change. And of course, it depends on where you're starting from, how severe the change is. If you grow up in a normal religious household, so a lot of developing is more of the same. Sometimes you discover new things. You go to yeshiva and hear and see new ways of serving Kodesh Baruch Hu, and you try to adapt to them. If you come from a non-religious household, then the changes are very profound. And one of the things that people have to deal with is that different parts of the personality change in different ways, at different speeds, with different difficulty, and for different people it's different. So if you imagine a simplistic division of a person into the intellectual and the emotional and the behavioral, you have people for whom an intellectual change is like taking off a jacket and putting on a different jacket. They think a lot and they have different systems in their head and they see the alternatives and they can imagine going from one to the other easily. But when it comes to wearing a yarmulke, or wearing tzitzis, or keeping Shabbos, that's a big deal. That means changing the whole structure of their lives, their relationships with other people, people's expectations for them, so that although they can put on this set of ideas quickly, the behaviors become very difficult. Neither of those is necessarily linked to the emotions. A person can decide to go along with the crowd and do what they do, but often he won't be feeling what they're feeling. Part of the time he feels he's paying some social dues so as to get currency in the group and to enjoy the benefits of being a member of the group. Whereas they're thrilled with what they're doing, singing L'Chadodi, with great spirit and great enthusiasm, and he's saying, well, I want to be invited to a Shabbos meal, so I better sing L'Chadodi. So for him, his intellect may be on board, and his behavior may be on board, but his emotions aren't on board. Now, a person who's in an environment which inspires him and makes him want to grow quickly and to fit in better, there's a tendency to emphasize that part of his personality which changes most quickly, most easily. And if it's a question of fitting with the group, and he'd be able to do it if one of those was the behavioral, and turning his gaze away from those other parts of his own personality, which change much more slowly, more difficult to change because that'll hold him back. And what happens is that at a certain point, he gets out of sync with himself. Part of himself is in, and part of himself isn't in. And then comes a crisis. I saw this with a boy who was in one of our summer camps many years ago, and he fell in love with Yiddishkeit, and he came from being absolutely non-observant and ignorant, put on a black hat, a black tie, a black suit, came to the yeshiva, was studying. In January, he came to me and said, I'm in the minyan 3 times a day, but I don't know if anybody's listening. Because he wasn't yet convinced that there was a creator, even though he was doing everything. And he realized he's coming apart at the seams. He's not a connected human being anymore. And that's a hurdle that often just causes the end of the project, because the person feels that he's lost his integrity, integratedness. So the counsel of wisdom is to progress more slowly, to pay attention to all parts of the personality and to use the part of the personality which changes with most difficulty and most slowly as the basic speedometer for the change entirely. Person should stay in touch with himself, not get out of sync with himself. This is very similar to what we advise when it comes to marriages. You have two people who get married, neither is religious, they're very happy with each other, and then sometime down the road, often when children are being expected, and one of the parents thinks, what am I going to give to my children? Not just money, not just trips, what life am I going to give to my children? What values, what identity do I want to give to my children? And one parent may become interested in his or her original Jewish upbringing and identity, and the other not. And this causes terrible friction between the husband and wife because you're talking about what they shall give to their children. There's hardly anything in life more important than that. So the one who's at present enthusiastic about handing on to the children a Jewish identity and is learning about it and going to groups and investing in Jewish experiences, and the other one thinks, you were religious when we married. You didn't prepare me for this. We didn't contract for this. And I want to live my own life. Don't dictate to me how I have to develop. So often the spouse who's ahead thinks, but you're retarding our integration into the Torah. You're retarding our performance of God's will and so forth and so on. And gets on a religious high horse and says, you have no right to hold us back and to hold the children back. The counsel usually is that the one who's ahead should slow down and we tell him or her, the most important thing for you is to maintain the togetherness of the marriage. Because the worst outcome is divorce. That's for sure. Children suffer terrible trauma in divorce. And if you don't know that, and if you're convinced the opposite, I can just pity you. I've seen cases where the divorced parent tells me, I don't know, my children came through it fine. They're doing fine. They're doing fine in schools. They have friends. I know what everybody's talking about. And 10 years later, there's a terrible breakdown. Every child suffers from divorce. Now, I would say that every child who goes through a divorce needs counseling. The only trouble is it needs a qualification. It needs good counseling. And that might be a challenge. Not all counseling is good. Not all counselors are good. But some kind of, even if not professional, some kind of counseling to help navigate the child's feelings, the child's crushed expectations, and the child's hopes for the future, and the child's sense of confidence, so that if the speed of development of one member in the family is going to, let's say the husband or the wife, is going to jeopardize the relationship with the spouse, the usual counsel, I say usual because no rules here are universal, but usual counsel is to the one who's moving more quickly, slow down. And communicate to your spouse that the most important thing in your life is your spouse. And that you want to do this together. And you want it to be a matter of each one's sincere commitment to this as a necessary value for the family. So again, the idea is to slow down the process to maintain integratedness. Yeah. Any other question? No. Yes.
Does the same principle apply for other types of interpersonal relationships?
Well, does the same principle apply to other types of interpersonal relationships? I don't think so, because there's no Nothing compares to marriage in terms of its consequences. Marriage, God willing, is going to produce children, and the husband and wife are going to have joint responsibility for the development of the children. You have a responsibility to your parents and to your siblings and to the members of the nuclear family and the wider family, but those responsibilities don't carry these kinds of consequences. So I don't think that anything compares directly to the kinds of severity that I'm talking about. So the general rule that you're hearing from me is that you have to gauge the long-term goal and approach the long-term goal in a slow enough pace to make it possible to achieve it. Now, there are objections to what I'm saying. I haven't heard them from rabbis so much as I've heard them from beginning students. And they are based on a sincere but extreme pietism. One time the objection goes like this. Look, Rabbi, did God give the Torah or not? Sure, God gave the Torah. And did God create us? Of course God created us. So God knows who we are? Sure, He knows who we are. And He told us we have to do all these things? Yeah. So surely we can do all these things right now, because He told us to. And He knows us. And He created us. And He created the laws we're supposed to live by. And then the student goes on. That means that if anyone fails in any mitzvah, he's a criminal. Because he could do it. All of them. Sometimes, if they have a sharp logical mind, they say, all of them perfectly. Everyone could be Moses. Everyone could be Abraham. Well, it sounds very unrealistic, doesn't it? I hope it does. On the other hand, what should we say about his logic? Well, what we say about his logic is this. There's a general cast of mind, there's a general sort of thought process, which is very tempting and almost always leads you into a trap. And the cast of mind is, this is what God wants, and this is what God knows, and this is what God does, and therefore this is what I have to do. It's almost always wrong. The therefore, this is what I have to do only follows from, and God gave us a rule to do this. If He gave us a rule to do it, then we have to do it. But if it's figured out from who God is and what God wants and how He runs the world, it could be dead wrong. He didn't teach us theology to know Him and ask us to figure out what to do. He taught us theology so we'll know what to believe, and then He told us what to do. So you want to figure out what to do, don't speculate about theoretical theology. Go to the rule book and see what the rule book says. So, for example, you hear people say, what? Give charity? What? Listen, God's running the world. Why is He poor? He's poor because God made Him poor, right? If God made Him poor, He wants Him poor, right? If He wants Him poor, who am I to interfere? If God wants him to recover from poverty, God will take care of that. I don't have to take care of that. It's up to God. He's running the world. So there, everything's true except the conclusion. Yes, God is running the world. Yes, God made him poor. Now, I'm going to change one thing he said. Yes, God wanted him poor. What did he say? God wants him poor. That's not right. God wanted him poor. But from the fact that God wanted him poor, doesn't follow that He wants him to continue to be poor. That doesn't follow. Well, what does He want? Oh, well, you look up the list of commandments, and one of them is charity. Aha. So even though God wanted him to be poor, and God has all control of everything that happens, He also wants us to give charity to poor people. That's what the rule says. So you follow the rule, not your intuition. Same thing with a doctor. A doctor says, listen, why is he ill? He's ill because God made him ill. Who am I to interfere by curing him? It's not my job. It's wrong to interfere with God's world. Excuse me. Whether it's right or wrong, look at the rule book. The rule book says, Rappo Yirapeh. It's appropriate to heal people who need to be healed, and therefore it's right to heal people. So God knows who we are, and God created the Torah and created us, and He commanded us to keep the Torah. Does it follow that we are able instantly to do all of it? Maybe yes, maybe no. So take and look into the rule books and see what they say, and see how they understand it. Now I'm going to read you a little bit from the Rambam, and then I'll try to explain it to you, and then I'll come back to give practical applications. Hilchos Tshuva, 5th chapter. The Rambam writes as follows: Rishus kol adam nesunalo. Now here Rishus doesn't mean what you're used to. It's meaning here it means power. Power is given to each person. Imrotza hatos atzmo lederech tova v'liyos tzadik harishus biyado. If he desires or wills to incline himself to a good way and to be a tzaddik, he has that power. And if he desires and wills to incline himself to an evil path and to be wicked, the power is in his hand. Now notice the Rambam's words here. He doesn't say you have free will so you can be a tzaddik. Oh no, it's not as simple as that. You have free will, and because you have free will, you can incline yourself to a path, a good path. So first thing you have to incline yourself. And that way, second step is get on the path. And the third step is walk the path. Right, walk the path. And then to be a tzaddik. That's not overnight. That might take more than 5 weeks. It might be a long time commitment. It certainly does not say that because you have free will, you can do everything instantly. Now in the end he says, because you have free will, you could be as much a tzaddik as Moses and as much as wicked as Yerovam ben Nevat. So you say, well, doesn't that mean that everybody can do everything perfectly? Well, first of all, Moses made mistakes. But besides that, not necessarily. Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman writes on that Rambam, this Rambam here, Maimonides says you could be as great a tzaddik as Moses. If I, Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman, would exert my utmost effort to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu for 1,000 years, I would not come up to Moses' ankles. So what does the Rambam mean? The Rambam means that just as Moshe Rabbeinu exerted all his effort to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so I too could exert all my effort to come up to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And if I use all my effort to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then I will be as big a tzaddik as Moses, though my performance won't match Moses, because I wasn't given the capabilities that Moses was given. Your output is determined by your effort and your resources. And the vast majority of us weren't given Moses' resources. So that means, according to Elchanan Wasserman, even though I have free will, he says he could serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu for 1,000 years and not come up to Moses' ankles. That means that he hasn't got the ability to go higher than Moses' ankles. Aha! So free will doesn't mean that you have the ability to do everything perfectly. It doesn't mean that. The premise we started with is wrong. Yes, HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the Torah. Yes, He created us. Yes, He knows us inside and out because He's our Creator. And yes, He commanded us to do all of it, but He doesn't expect us to do all of it. Now, let's stop and figure that out. Why would you command somebody to do something you didn't expect them to do? In fact, there's a famous philosopher named Immanuel Kant who held an opposite position. Well, of course, if Kant's philosophy contradicts Rabbi Chanan, then Kant is wrong. Torah is right and he's wrong. Kant says you can't have an obligation to do something unless you're able to do it. Ought implies can. To say that you ought to do something, it assumes that you have the ability to do it. We're being told, no, that's not true. We're being told that HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded us all to do all the mitzvahs. He commanded us all to do all the mitzvahs perfectly. And yet, He doesn't expect us to succeed. So what does it mean to be commanded when there's no expectation of success? What it means is this, that the lack of ability doesn't remove the obligation. The lack of ability removes any penalty for not succeeding. Those two things are different. They're related, but they're different. When a person claims, I couldn't have done any better, what is he trying to establish? According to the Torah, here's the situation. He was supposed to do something and he didn't do it. And now he's going to be criticized, he's going to be penalized. He says, it's not fair to criticize me or penalize me because I wasn't able to do it. That the Torah acknowledges. Onus Rachmana Patre, if a person is incapable of doing what he ought, Kadosh Baruch Hu relieves him from punishment. But that doesn't take away the obligation. The obligation is still there. It's just that failure can be justified on the grounds of inability. So, yes, the HaKadosh Baruch Hu commands the whole thing and will not levy any punishment whatsoever if there's any failure. So you say, well, then what's the point of the obligation if you're not going to be punished for failure? One of the points is, I know that if I were able to acquire more ability, if I were able to grow, if I were able to accumulate more resources, then I would be able to fulfill more obligations, and I should do that. If inability removes the obligation, there's no motivation to change. There's no motivation to improve. I'm not obligated. I'm doing everything that I'm obligated to do because I'm doing everything that I can do. But what about acquiring more acquiring more ability, more strength, more understanding, more self-control, more knowledge, more training? Why should I? I'm not obligated to do those things. Should you volunteer to cause yourself to become obligated so you'll do more obligations? Morality doesn't require that. But if you are obligated and you're only pleading in vulnerability for punishment, then, but you know there are obligations you're not living up to, then you look for opportunities. This is a tremendous spur for growth. And this is the Torah's position. And one place that it shows is if you can't fulfill your obligation, Torah obligation, a mitzvah, and I could help you do it, should I do it? Should I help you do it? If you think like Emmanuel can't, why should I do it? Since you can't, you're not obligated. If you're not obligated, you're morally perfect. You're doing everything that you ought to do. I should give you something to create another obligation so you can fulfill that another obligation? Why should I do that? Why should you do that? According to the Torah's point of view, you're obligated in all 613, and you're not doing it because you can't. If I give you more means, there are more other things you ought to do that you're able to do. So, this is one example of where the Rambam indicates that it is a process of improvement, not a matter of instantaneous ability to do everything perfectly right. There's another place in Hilchos Deos, the Rambam organizes character traits generally into a structure of a continuum which has two extremes and a middle. And the two extremes are polar opposites of one another, and the middle is a kind of compromise between them. And generally, the best character trait to have is the one that's in the middle, or close to the middle. It's a very complicated, subtle business I'm not going into now. But that's the general idea. So for example, you have spending money. There are people, probably know people like this, who can't hold on to money. If they get money, they spend it right away. Good things, bad things, they just can't hold on to money. Then there are people who can't spend money, period. There was a guy in the Midwest, when he died, it was found that his mattress was stuffed with $250,000 in cash. He lived in a house with no heating, and his clothes were threadbare, and his food was very paltry. He couldn't spend money on himself, let alone anything else or anybody else. Both of those are sicknesses. The healthy position for a person is to be able to make judgments about what he's going to spend money on, to invest in things that will have the best long-term effects, and to withhold from things which are dangerous or injurious. And that takes training and takes self-control. Now the Rambam says, let's imagine a person who's at one extreme. Let's say he just throws everything away. How am I going to get him to the middle? Says the Rambam, not by going from the extreme to the middle. That's not how you do it. Now, he doesn't actually say the words, it's not possible, but I think the way he describes it, that's what it sounds like. The therapy for this condition is to go from one extreme to the other extreme. Now, that means like this. Emotionally, he gives money out, just gets rid of it. You tell him, we want you to behave like a tight-fisted person who can't spend anything. Of course you don't feel that way. You feel you want to give the money out, fight that feeling. And don't spend a penny. By going to the other extreme in behavior, he can break the hold of that drive to throw everything away. Once he breaks the hold of that drive, then he can start to gravitate to the center, where he develops a new inner dynamic, where he buys the things that are really helpful to him and discards the things that are not helpful to him. So now let's figure this out. Both extremes are bad. Rambam says if someone's stuck on the spendthrift side, the first thing he should do is, in his behavior, move to the other bad side and spend nothing. Well, doesn't he have free will? Why doesn't he just choose to be in the middle? Because you can't get there that way. It's a two-step process, not a one-step process. And while he's dying to spend everything and he's stuck his fist in his pocket and not spending a dime, his feelings are bad and his behavior is bad. It's bad. That's where he belongs. He belongs doing that bad behavior because that bad behavior is a stepping stone to getting to the center where he belongs. So again, you see that this is a matter of a process. It's not a matter of just deciding to be perfect and becoming perfect. So what is his status in the process while he's undergoing rehabilitation? Well, he's taking steps in the right direction, which is part of the Mata Asmo El Haderech HaTova. He's inclining himself towards the good path, and he's walking the good path. All of that he gets credit for. Even though he hasn't become a tzaddik yet. He gets credit for doing whatever he can to move in that direction. And eventually, with Hashem's help, he'll make it to the center, and then he will have achieved, in this respect, being a tzaddik. So that means being a tzaddik in both feeling and in behavior. So this is what Rabbi Chanan is describing. What's this guy's status in the meantime? He's doing everything he can. Therefore, he's not liable to any penalty for failure, because the failure is something that's beyond his ability. Now, it's our understanding of the human being, and I think it's the common understanding, that when you reach maturity, you already have certain character traits. Some kids are naturally lazy, some kids are naturally energetic, some kids are naturally generous, some kids are naturally selfish, Some kids are naturally thinkers, some kids are naturally actors without thought, some are deep into their feelings. Children are different. Each of these character traits has good and bad applications, and there are other character traits which should be developed, and developing your character is a lifelong project. And since it's a lifelong project, it's not something which, using your free will, you can just decide to be generous, decide to be energetic, decide to be helpful. You're not created that way. Gaon of Vilna says that the purpose of life is to fix your midos, your character traits, and it is harder to fix one character trait than it is to learn the whole Talmud. If you've brushed your elbow on the Talmud once or twice, you have a little picture about how hard it is, and it's 5,740 pages of Talmud, 2,700 folios, and it's harder to fix one trait, and your obligation is to fix all your traits. Are you able to do that? You don't know, because a lot of it happens through the help of heaven, and your job is to start the process and to beseech HaKadosh Baruch Hu for help, and in that way, he can give you the help to make progress that you couldn't have dreamed of. This has happened to quite a number of people that I've come in contact with. There was a fellow who told me the following story that happened to him in yeshiva. I don't remember which yeshiva he was in, but there was a fellow sitting next to him on the bench, and the person talking to me said, I noticed this fellow was learning a certain daf and a certain Gemara every day in the same daf. Every day the same daf. So after a couple of weeks, I said, what about turning the page? There's more stuff on the next page. He said, this is what I learned. My interlocutor couldn't grasp it. He couldn't reconcile himself to it. He said to me again, but what are you doing? You're just learning the same daf every day? He said, listen, I find that I learn, but I don't remember what I learned. So I go over it again. And after some more time, the interlocutor says, not everybody's supposed to be learning in yeshiva. Yeshiva is for people who have certain types of abilities and make certain types of progress. Maybe you should think about an alternative. So the fellow said to him, look, my father wants me in yeshiva, and he's paying me for to be in yeshiva, so I'm in yeshiva. No, that was that. I lost track of him. Remembered his name, he lost track of him. But 30 years later, he was coming to a visit to Eretz Israel, and someone told him that fellow was now living in Bnei Brak. Oh, Bnei Brak. Okay, maybe I'll look him up. So he goes there, but he didn't have an address. So he goes to Bnei Brak, and he walks into an area, and he asks someone on the street, do you know so-and-so? He says, oh, you mean the great Talmid Chacham? He says, I don't think so. Maybe two people have the same name. Well, there's only one person there by that name. He lives in that house. So he walks in. He says, I remember you from 30 years ago. You seem to have a reputation on the street of success and learning. He says, yes. He says, well, what happened? He said, I don't know. After a while, I began to remember. And after a while, I began to understand. And then I went on to the next stuff, the next stuff, the next stuff. I did understand. I did remember. And I kept doing it. And it happened. And that's a contemporary story. There's stories about great people. Rabbi Chana Wasserman was a teenager, was having trouble with learning. And he went into the shul one time when nobody was there. He opened up the Aron Kodesh and put his head inside and said, Ribono Shel Olam, make me smart so I can learn your Torah. And that was the turning point. If I'm not mistaken, it's Rabbi Akiva Eger who overheard his parents talking and saying to one another, what's going to be with Akiva? He's not doing well in school, and he's not seem to be serious. Maybe we can get him to be an apprentice to a tailor, and he'll learn how to sew clothes, and so on and so on. He thought to himself, a tailor? I'm going to be a tailor? That's what turned him around. It wasn't easy. Not everybody starts off, doing what he does at 60. There were struggles. So you don't know what kind of siyata d'shmaya you're going to get, what kind of help from heaven you're going to get. But don't artificially limit your sights. On the other hand, don't push yourself too hard. Now let's go back to what we started with. What is too hard? How do you know what is too hard? Well, let's imagine someone who's calculating. Am I ready to take on this new getter? Learning 10 minutes before davening. I was told that learning before davening is a good thing. It's a wonderful way to start your day. Get it 10 minutes earlier and learn for 10 minutes before davening. Am I ready for that or not? Well, first thing you could do is ask advice. People who know you over some period of time and watch you develop. If you've shared your decisions with them, some of which succeeded, some of which failed, you could then get good advice from them. People who tell you, how can people give me advice? They don't know me as well as I do. They don't know me as well as I know myself. They need to speak to several psychologists. The whole of psychology exists because you don't know yourself as well as somebody else might know you. Again, you have to find the right psychologist. Just having a degree isn't enough. But often, you yourself don't know what's best for you. So if you have people who can give you advice, and my analogy here is an analogy of sports, which I have done to a certain extent, and I'm still doing certain types of training. Very often, a person who's doing sports or doing training doesn't know how to evaluate his own abilities. When I was, 60, 20 years ago, I was in a gym, and I was running 3 miles in a half hour, and the trainer there said, I think you could run 4.5 miles in 45 minutes. 50% increase, 60 years old. I thought, maybe that's a little dangerous, Shouldn't we go up by little intervals? He said, no, I think you could do it. So I thought to myself, well, he's a professional trainer. What do I know? So I said, okay, I'll do it. And to my own surprise, I did it. It wasn't even as great a strain as I thought. Because if you're doing 30 minutes, by 28 minutes, you give yourself permission to feel tired. And by 30 minutes, you think, okay, I'm done. But if you're doing 45 minutes, at 30 minutes, you're just thinking, okay, so it's another 10, 15 minutes to go. You don't feel the same way. Mentally, you don't feel the same way. So I was shocked that I was able to do it. On the other hand, when I wanted to do certain things that pained me, they said, no, don't do it. You're risking injury, and if you injure yourself, you can't train at all. That's not smart. Better to slow yourself down and make sure you're comfortable with what you're doing. Yes, you could strain, but not pain. No pain, no gain is wrong. It's not correct. So these people can give you advice. Now, the same thing's true with taking on something new in Yiddishkeit. If it succeeds, wonderful. If it doesn't succeed, it has the psychological implication, maybe I wasn't cut out for this. Maybe this isn't right for me because I made a wrong decision about myself. I thought that I could, that I can't. Maybe other things I think about myself aren't correct. You lose your self-confidence. You have a sense of loss of direction. Better to not take the step until you really are ready, and then take the step and do it successfully. There's something called behavioral therapy. Behavioral therapy also talks about making progress in small increments and rewarding yourself after each increment. And one of the biggest rules is don't take steps that are too big. Break them down into smaller steps and take them gradually. So I think that's true for our development as well. We have to take small steps and allow them to accumulate. And under the advice of a guide who has the experience and the insight to be able to gauge what would be the size of the small step. That's one strategy. Another strategy is when you're taking a new step, to take it experimentally. Don't say, well, now I'm committing myself to this. Say, now I'm going to try this and see how it works. I'll try it for a month, and after a month, I'll reevaluate. Now here's a crucial idea. What does it mean to reevaluate? It means reevaluate everything you're doing, not just whether you were able to maintain this new step that you're taking. Let's imagine that it's not 10 minutes before davening. Let's say it's an hour before davening. Davening is 7:30. The alarm usually goes off at 7, and you're there at 7:30. Now the alarm's going to go off at 6. You'll be there at 6:30, and you'll learn from 6:30 to 7:30, and daven from 7:30 to 8:30. Okay. After a month, I got up every morning at 6. I was downstairs by 6:30. I learned for an hour. That's great. That's wonderful. How were you at 8 p.m.? How were you at 9 p.m.? Do you have any responsibilities at that time? Were you too tired to perform them? Were you grumpy and irritable when people needed your help at that time and you couldn't give it to them? Was it worth it to lose out in the quality of your avoda at 9 p.m. in order to be able to have an extra hour of learning at 6:30 a.m.? Maybe not. You need to make what's called a bottom line evaluation. Take everything into account, the pluses and minuses, and see whether it was really a step ahead in your avoda. The advantage of making it experimental is that if it doesn't work, you say, okay, I thought about it, I tried, I found that it wasn't for me now, I'll try it again in 2 years. You didn't lose anything. You didn't turn out to be mistaken about your abilities and mistaken about the project. You did it as an experiment to gather information, and you gathered the information, and you made the right decision. So I think that's a way of helping to gauge the right element of progress to make. There's another thing to take into account, and that is the consequences. This is part of what I said before, but it's a different dimension. The consequences of what you do. Because when you undertake a certain way of serving the Kodesh Baruch Hu, this may have consequences for you and for other people that you do not foresee. You have to be quite broad-minded to try to envision those consequences. Yeah.
Can I ask a question about the example you just gave?
Sure.
In terms of gauging that after consequence, whenever you're, for example, so that specific example, you gave like an hour before and an hour after you're learning, and then it affects you after that in the rest of your work for the rest of the day. How can you gauge that? Because for one, learning Torah is a very hard thing to kind of quantify, and then also beyond that, your success or failure in the avodah that takes place after isn't necessarily a consequence of whether you did your work in the learning. So whenever you learn, it doesn't, and then you, let's say you failed after, it doesn't necessarily mean that you failed because you were, in your learning you took too long, and therefore that failure was a cause of that, even if, like, let's say you feel less, or you have less energy to work after that avodah. You don't know if that failure is a consequence of your learning, or that failure is a consequence of that's how it should have happened. Because isn't everything b'yadei shamayim, like everything is from Hashem, so that success or failure is
See, this is an example of the thinking that I said before. Sure, everything is in Hashem's hands, and that failure is what He wants you to have. Maybe He wants you to have it to tell you not to do it. That's why He wants you to have it. Just learn from that not to do it.
It's true, maybe, but then it's also true the other way around as well. No?
Okay, but it doesn't follow that because He wants it. Therefore, the right thing to do is to continue to do it. That's the proposition you were pushing for.
So how would you gauge it? Is what I'm asking.
Okay, I think the real question is the first question. And I think that's a real question. And you're gaining the hour of learning, and you're degrading your ability to do the things that need to be done at 9 p.m. You have to go to a Rav and explain what you're doing, explain what the consequences are, and have him evaluate it for you. I don't think you're able to evaluate it. There are too many variables involved. And as far as whether it's a causal consequence or not, I think usually your life experience helps you. You know, in times when you've been sleep deprived for other reasons, you were at a chasana, or there was a plane delay, or whatever it is, and you know how it degraded your behavior under those conditions. You know yourself to a certain extent. So, it isn't that there's a secret poison gas in the air and that's degrading you at night that you don't know about. That's really not a consequence of what happened in the morning. People have enough self-knowledge to usually get that sort of thing right. We base our lives on that. A person says, I need another half hour sleep at night. How do you know you need it? Maybe you don't, and maybe it won't help. And because I know myself, I know when I get sleep, I'm one way. If I don't get sleep, I'm another way. And I think those are reasonable judgments to make. But the evaluative judgment, you're absolutely right. To gauge the extra value of the Talmud Torah versus the loss of value in avoda at night is something that a Rav would need to be able to do. And by the way, there's a third way to fix it, and that is to increase the quality of the learning in the morning so that it inspire you more, so that there won't be a degrading of your behavior at night. That's another way to do it if the learning is done in a certain way, perhaps with a good chavrusa, or a subject that you're very interested in, which will carry you through the day, and then the behavior at night won't be degraded. But the point that I'm making is only that it's got to be a bottom line evaluation. It's not that I tried to do X and I succeeded to do X, so the project is a success. You have to take into account the costs of the project as well. It has to be a bottom line evaluation. So the Gemara says that roughly it says, in anyone whose days the temple wasn't built, it's as if the temple was destroyed in his days. Now, the word in Hebrew is biyamav. Biyamav can mean in his days. But biyamav has another meaning. The base can be instrumental. When you do something with a tool, the particle is base. You dig with a shovel, and a chofer bedeker. I use the deker. The base is the using. So the Kotzker Rebbe said, anyone whose days are not used to build the temple, it's as if his days are used to destroy the temple. And then the picture that's being given is this. Every day you have the capability of making a brick. And you sign your name in that brick. And the brick goes to the kiln and comes out baked, solid brick. And there's a giant warehouse for bricks. And when the Mashiach comes, he's going to build the Beis HaMikdash out of those bricks. Each one of the bricks that he put in with his name. So it means any day in which you didn't build a brick to build the Beis HaMikdash, that's a day as if it's spent in destroying the Beis HaMikdash. And now the motto, which I would advise to be on every Jewish wall, is don't despise small steps. I'm into alliteration. Don't despise small steps. How big can a building be if it's built out of bricks? Go to New York City. You have 80-story buildings built out of bricks. That's real tall. A brick is this size, but the building is 80 stories tall. Each day is a brick. You have thousands and thousands of days, tens of thousands of days. Tens of thousands of bricks can build a gigantic mansion. One of the tricks of the Yeshivat Ohr is to say, it's only one day. Really? But it's one brick, one less brick. It's only a brick. If you take that seriously, he's got you in his pocket. And if you can make it up from a 1 pound brick to a 17-ounce brick, that's a step forward. That's a step forward. That's the kind of progress that you have to learn to treasure. And one way to do this, the last thing I'm going to say, one way to do this is this. Imagine a person climbing a mountain, a tall mountain, 5,000 feet. So there are foothills, he comes in. And the closer he gets to look to the top, further back, he has to crane his head to be able to see the top. Climbing. Does the top look much closer? Not for a long while, doesn't it? But turn around and look down. Oh, that's very different. Look at all the ground I covered. One way you can do this is to keep a diary. Just keep track of where you are. This is what I can do. This is what I can't do. This is the problem. This is what I'm facing. This is what I'm trying to do. You keep a diary like that for a couple of years. When you get discouraged, you take a look at that diary and say, wow, 2 years ago I was there. You don't remember where you were. You don't remember where. How do I know you don't remember? Because I didn't remember. When I was in Yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael, and I came back, and I was in Baltimore, and I was asked to give a shir, and somehow somebody convinced me to do Yevamas. Okay, so I prepared the first Mishnah, and the guys came in. There was one really bright guy there. And he twisted me into a pretzel. I could not make sense out of the Mishnah. So, okay, come back next week. Do a better job. Came back next week, and it, again, twisted into a pretzel. I could not make sense out of the Mishnah. Okay, so we gave it up. Some years later, I decided to join the Daf Yomi, and the first Masechta in sight was Yevamos. I thought, oh no, this is my nemesis. This is my Waterloo. This is the Yevamos. So I decided a month before it starts, I'm going to sit down with the Mishnah and the Gemara. I'm going to try to learn them and try to prepare them. So I sat down with the Mishnah. It was easy. It was easy. I had no clue how far I had come in the intervening years. I myself had no idea. So when you get a glance back like that, that's very useful in terms of giving you the self-confidence to push and keep going forward. So keeping a diary is a good idea. Okay?